The air in the Ohio River Valley in the autumn of 1823 was thick and heavy, not with humidity, but with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and an underlying metallic tang that Sergeant Jasper Crow knew instinctively. Blood. The sky was a bruised, sullen gray, mirroring the mood of the three men riding through the thickets. They were not lawmen, but bounty hunters, their business grim and purely transactional. Jasper, a man whose face had been weathered into a permanent scowl by a life of hard choices and little sleep, led the trio. His partners were Silas, a wiry, nervous man who constantly chewed on tobacco, and Finn, a hulking brute whose quietness was more unnerving than any boast. Their target was a slave named Caleb, a man of mythic size and strength who had escaped a plantation near Cincinnati. The reward was considerable, enough to buy them a small piece of land, or more likely, drink themselves into oblivion for a month. "Hold up," Jasper rasped, pulling his tired horse to a stop. His breath plumed white in the cold morning air. They were deep in a wooded area, miles from any settled township, where the boundaries between civilization and true wilderness were not marked on any map. The ground here was a treacherous mix of mud and rock, making tracking difficult, but Silas had been earning his keep. "He passed this way, Sarge," Silas affirmed, spitting a brown stream into the dirt. "Big stride. See, not just deep, but wide, like he was trying to break the earth, not just walk on it." Jasper dismounted, examining the track. Caleb was no ordinary man. Plantation rumors described him as a giant, capable of prodigious feats of labor, and now, escape. But what held Jasper's attention wasn't the size of the footprint, but a detail beside it. A faint but distinct impression of a small, soft deerskin boot. A woman's footprint. "He ain't alone," Jasper muttered, drawing his heavy hunting knife. "Looks like a woman, following or leading. Shawnee, maybe. Or a white settler trying to prove a point." "A woman ain't gonna stop Caleb," Finn rumbled, his voice like stones grinding together. "And she ain't gonna stop us. She's just a complication, Sarge. More blood money, maybe." Jasper shook his head. "A woman is always a complication, Finn. Especially one out here alone. They know these woods better than any of us. We proceed with caution. This ain't a runaway we're chasing anymore. It's a trap, waiting to be sprung." The tracks, once sporadic, now became clearer, leading them towards a narrow, shadowed creek bed. The air grew colder, and a thin, unsettling fog began to drift between the trees, obscuring their visibility. Jasper felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the biting cold. This wasn't just a pursuit. It felt like an infiltration. As they neared the creek, a chilling sight stopped them dead in their tracks. It wasn't the giant slave, nor a woman waiting with a weapon. It was a scene of calculated, brutal violence. 3 men lay sprawled near the muddy bank. They were not their group, but another team of bounty hunters Jasper vaguely recognized from a tavern back in Ohio. 3 men known for their cruelty and efficiency. They were all dead. Silas choked on his tobacco. Finn looked pale. "Look close," Jasper ordered, forcing himself to examine the bodies. The manner of their death was the true source of the terror. One man's throat was slit with surgical precision, a clean, deep cut. The second had been strangled, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, indicating immense, focused strength. The third was pinned to the ground by his own hunting axe, driven through his chest with crushing force. There was no frenzy here, no wild struggle. It was execution. "Caleb didn't do this," Jasper whispered, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods, now silent and intensely hostile. "He's strong, but this is skill. The first 2 maybe, but the axe, that's personal. Look at the mud." He pointed to the ground beside the body with the twisted neck. Beside the large print of Caleb's foot was the small, distinct impression of the deerskin boot again. The woman. She's not just leading him, boys. She's protecting him. Jasper stated, the realization setting in like a block of ice in his gut. And she just eliminated the competition. She wants this man for herself, for whatever reason. The original mission, retrieving a runaway slave for a bounty, had just mutated into something far darker, a confrontation with a highly skilled killer operating with motive and precision. She could be Shawnee. They don't leave tracks like this by accident. This is a warning, Silas whimpered, his hands shaking as he reached for his rifle. A warning we can't ignore, Jasper agreed. But his mind was already racing, piecing together the psychological profile of their new adversary. Why would a woman, Shawnee or otherwise, risk everything to defend a runaway slave? Was it love, alliance, or something far more chilling, a power play in the unforgiving wilderness? As they remounted, the silence of the woods felt like a physical weight pressing down on them. The fog seemed to intensify, wrapping around the trees like ghostly shrouds. We follow the tracks, Jasper decided, his voice low and firm, betraying none of the fear he felt. But from now on, we hunt the woman. She is the lock, and Caleb is the key. The 3 bodies back there, that's the price of failure. He glanced back at the scene, making a mental note of the methodical cruelty. This wasn't a scared fugitive. This was a purposeful, dangerous alliance that had already claimed 3 lives and wasn't finished. The trail was leading them deeper into the maze of the forest and closer to a confrontation where the rules of civilization, law, and morality had completely dissolved. They were now in a game of survival, and the woman had just established herself as the deadliest player. This is just the beginning of the darkness. If you want to know what happens next in the chilling hunt through the woods of 1823, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next chapter of this terrifying story. Jasper, Silas, and Finn rode slowly, their eyes darting through the dense, fog-choked woods. The discovery of the 3 dead bounty men had changed the hunt from a profitable retrieval into a desperate test of survival. The tracks of the large man, Caleb, were almost always accompanied by the small, precise tracks of the woman. She was the architect of their terror, a silent predator moving through a landscape she intimately controlled. The trio had discarded the horses, tethering them deep in a copse where they hoped they would remain safe. On foot, they were quieter, but the thick undergrowth made their progress laborious and slow. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot, every bird cry felt like a signal. "She's leading us, Sarge," Silas whispered, his voice strained and high-pitched. He held his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. "She knows we're here, and she's just waiting for the terrain to give her the advantage." "Of course she knows," Jasper replied, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow despite the chill. "She's not running. She's herding. Look at how she moves. She avoids the high, dry ground where we could spot her easily and sticks to the gullies and the creek beds. She's using the landscape like a shield." They stopped by a patch of dense rhododendrons. Jasper knelt and found a fresh sign. Not a footprint, but a piece of fabric, snagged on a thorn, a small, dark piece of rough cotton, clearly torn from Caleb's slave attire. It was a sign, but was it a genuine accident or a deliberate lure? Finn, usually the most stoic, pointed silently towards a patch of mist where the trees thinned slightly. "Did you hear that?" Like a groan. They froze. The only sounds were the drip of water from the mossy branches and the frantic thumping of their own hearts. Jasper strained his ears. Silence. "It's the wind, Finn." "Calm yourself," Jasper said, though his own senses were screaming danger. But the silence was deceptive. Minutes later, as they crept past a large fallen oak, they found the evidence of the woman's movements. A small, shallow fire pit, recently extinguished, the ashes still warm enough to steam faintly. Beside it, the remains of a small roasted rabbit and 2 distinct impressions in the soft earth. Caleb's large handprint and the woman's kneeling spot. They stopped for a rest, Jasper noted. She's making sure he eats, making sure he rests. She's caring for him. This isn't a fleeting connection, boys. This is a commitment. The psychological pressure was mounting. The woman wasn't just a physical threat. She was challenging their belief in the natural order of things. A solitary, indigenous woman protecting a fugitive slave against the organized power of white men. As they moved on, Jasper decided they needed to change tactics. Direct pursuit was suicidal. They needed to anticipate her destination. "Silas, where are we?" Jasper asked, pulling out a crude hand-drawn map of the region. Silas, despite his fear, was the best tracker and cartographer of the group. "We're pushing west, Sarge, towards the Shawnee territory across the river. But we're still deep in what used to be called the neutral grounds, no man's land. If she hits the river, she'll be trying to find a crossing that isn't watched. The old ferry crossing near Fort Deposit? Too far south, too public. No, she'll be aiming for the Broken Falls, a series of shallow rapids where a strong man could wade across, even this time of year." Jasper snapped the map shut. "Broken Falls. That's our destination. We stop tracking her every move and start anticipating her goal. We circle wide, get ahead of her, and set an ambush." The risk was immense. If they misjudged her path, they would lose her forever. But if they kept following her tailored path, they were guaranteed to meet the same bloody end as the last 3 bounty men. They turned northwest, leaving the clear tracks behind, aiming for a ridge that promised a quicker route to the Broken Falls. The climb was punishing, testing their exhaustion and resolve. As they scrambled up a slippery bank, Finn cried out and stumbled, his boot catching on a concealed root. He didn't fall far, but as he struggled to regain his balance, he noticed something tucked into the crook of the root. A small wooden doll. It was crudely carved, but clearly identifiable as a white man wearing a tiny, familiar-looking vest. Finn stared at it, speechless. It wasn't a warning of violence, but a sign of intimate knowledge. It looked almost exactly like Silas's common hunting vest. Silas, seeing Finn's frozen horror, rushed over. He grabbed the doll, turning it over and over in his trembling hands. "She saw us. She didn't just pass by. She saw us. She knows who we are. She knows what we look like." The terror was no longer abstract. It was personal and immediate. The woman was not just capable of lethal violence, she was observing them, studying them, and playing psychological games. The doll was a chilling confirmation that the roles were utterly reversed. They were the hunted. Jasper snatched the doll from Silas. "It's a distraction. She wants us panicking. Slow down. We burn this and we move. Now, Broken Falls quickly." But the momentum was broken. The confidence that had sustained them had evaporated, replaced by gnawing doubt. How long had she been watching them? Had she seen them set the horses? Did she know their names? As they began their hurried, panicked ascent towards the ridge, the mist around them seemed to swirl faster. They were moving into the unknown, leaving the established trail only to step into an invisible circle of dread. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was a watchful, malevolent entity, breathing down their necks, guided by a killer with a purpose. The urgency to reach the Broken Falls before Caleb and the woman consumed the 3 bounty hunters. The psychological damage inflicted by the small wooden doll had been profound. Finn was constantly looking over his shoulder, Silas was muttering prayers mixed with curses, and even Jasper, the hardened leader, was plagued by visions of the woman's face, a face he hadn't even seen yet, but which he imagined as cold and utterly resolute. The ridge climb was grueling. The ground was steep and littered with loose shale, making every step treacherous. They moved away from the heavy forest floor and into a landscape of jagged rock outcroppings, where the wind whipped past and visibility remained poor due to the perpetual mist clinging to the heights. "We should have stayed low," Finn groaned, struggling to keep up. "The ridge is too exposed. She could be watching us from any rise. We had no choice, Jasper countered, breathing hard. She was controlling the low ground. Here, we can move faster and force her to move to the open if she wants to stop us. If she's so set on silence and stealth, the ridge disrupts her plan. They reached a narrow ledge that offered a temporary rest and, more importantly, a sweeping view, or what would have been a view had the fog not been so stubborn. Below them they could vaguely discern the winding path of the creek, confirming they were ahead of their quarry. Silas, while resting his legs, noticed a peculiar formation of stones nearby. They were arranged in a small, tight circle, and inside the circle, a single blackened feather lay centered. "Sarge, look," Silas pointed, his voice barely above a whisper. Jasper cautiously approached the stones. He recognized the pattern immediately. It was an old Shawnee travel marker, one that wasn't designed to tell where someone was going, but to silently communicate a warning to anyone who understood the sign. "What is it?" Finn asked, shuffling closer. "It's a boundary marker," Jasper explained, though his stomach churned with dread. "It means this area is forbidden, protected, or someone is watching it. And the feather, it's a crow feather. The crow is clever, observant. It means the watcher is smart and dangerous." The woman wasn't just using the natural environment, she was using her cultural knowledge to amplify the terror. She knew they would recognize the sign, or at least recognize that it was intended for them. It was a calculated display of power, a silent declaration that this was her land. They quickly moved past the unsettling marker, pushing down a steep wooded slope towards the sound of rushing water, the Broken Falls. They had to be there now, before Caleb and the woman arrived. The terrain grew unstable as they descended. The earth was loose, and the dense fog made estimating distances impossible. Suddenly Silas, who was leading the descent, yelled and disappeared with a sickening crunch. Jasper and Finn rushed forward. Silas had fallen into a deep, narrow ravine, concealed perfectly by a curtain of mist and overhanging brush. He was lying at the bottom, approximately 12 feet down, clutching his leg. "It's broken! It's broken!" he screamed, his face contorted in agony. Jasper peered over the edge. "Silas, hold still. We'll get you out." "It's a trap, Sarge. It was too easy," Silas cried, his eyes wide with sudden realization. Jasper felt a cold dread settle over him. Silas was right. The ravine was too well hidden, too perfectly placed on their fastest descent route. It wasn't an accident of the terrain, it was a strategically placed pitfall. But now they were compromised. Finn had to stay and help Silas, or Caleb and the woman would reach the falls unchallenged. "Finn, you stay here. Get Silas secured. Use rope to pull him up slowly." "I'm going ahead," Jasper ordered, his voice sharp with adrenaline. "Alone? Sarge, she's out there," Finn protested, hefting his rifle nervously. "She's betting I won't leave him. She's betting I'll hesitate. I won't. She wins if we stay together and become easy targets. She wants to divide and conquer, and I'm letting her divide us. But I'll use it to conquer her," Jasper hissed. He quickly tossed a coil of rope down to Silas, gave Finn a grim look, and continued his descent alone, leaving the sounds of Finn's panicked reassurances and Silas's muffled cries behind him. The terror was now a singular, paralyzing force. Jasper was utterly isolated, racing through a landscape designed to kill him, chasing an enemy who seemed to know his every move. His mission had boiled down to a single desperate gamble: reach the Broken Falls, set his own trap, and pray the woman was predictable enough to fall for it. He plunged through the last of the undergrowth, the roar of the falls growing deafening. The air was misty and cold, thick with the spray of the water. He found himself standing on a small rocky shelf overlooking the rapids. The water here was shallow, easily waded by a large man. This was the crossing point. Jasper immediately looked for cover. A large cluster of boulders near the water's edge offered the best chance. He took position, rifle raised, heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. He waited, the minutes stretching into an eternity. He listened past the roar of the water, straining for the slightest sound of movement. He was freezing, exposed and absolutely alone. Suddenly, a faint shadow moved through the fog on the opposite bank. It wasn't Caleb. It was the woman. She was smaller than he expected, draped in dark, simple clothing, her hair braided. She carried nothing but a knife and a small pouch. She was scanning the water, testing the current. Her expression, even from a distance, was one of intense, calculating focus. Then, she stopped. She wasn't looking at the water. She was looking directly at the cluster of boulders where Jasper was hiding. Her eyes, dark and sharp, seemed to pierce the fog and the heavy granite. She hadn't seen him. She knew he was there. A slow, deliberate smile stretched across her lips. A smile devoid of warmth or fear, purely a demonstration of superior knowledge. She looked down, picked up a single, smooth river stone, and tossed it. The stone didn't hit the water. It sailed through the air and landed with a soft thud exactly 3 feet behind Jasper's hiding spot. She had pinned his location without even seeing him move. It was a chilling display of mastery over the environment and an unnerving insight into the psychological profile of a human predator. Jasper gripped his rifle, his finger on the trigger, the suspense unbearable. He knew he had seconds before she did something decisive. The confrontation at the Broken Falls was a standoff defined not by firepower, but by psychological warfare. Jasper was pinned, knowing the woman had established his precise location. The sound of the river provided excellent cover, but it also made it impossible to hear her next move. He calculated his options. 1. Shoot, fire now, blindly into the fog where he last saw her. He risked missing, revealing his position completely and alerting Caleb. 2. Flee, retreat back up the slope to aid Silas and Finn. This meant sacrificing the chance to capture Caleb and admitting total defeat. 3. Hold. Wait for her to cross or for Caleb to appear, using the element of surprise if she moved into a less advantageous position. He chose to hold. He needed Caleb. The reward, and his own sense of pride, demanded it. He adjusted his position slightly, shifting his weight just enough to peer around the mossy boulder. The opposite bank was empty. She was gone. Not run, but vanished, swallowed by the relentless fog and the dense thickets. Where did she go? The question hammered in his mind. She wouldn't retreat. She was too confident, too committed. She had demonstrated her dominance, and now was the time to strike. Jasper's eyes darted wildly, scanning the ridge behind him, the river, and the small patches of forest flanking the falls. His heart rate soared, convinced she was already circling, knife drawn, ready to deliver the precise, lethal cut that had dispatched the first bounty man. Suddenly the water near the main cascade of the falls began to churn violently. Not the woman, but Caleb emerged from the spray. He was massive, his bare torso glistening with water, moving with a raw, primal power. He was wading through the strongest part of the current, his shoulders straining against the force, heading for the opposite bank. Jasper had his target. He leveled his rifle, the bead sighting Caleb's broad back. This was the moment. He had the advantage of position and weapon. But a whisper of sound, barely audible over the roaring water, stopped him. It came from above him. He looked up, and through a brief, agonizing break in the fog, he saw her. The woman was not on the opposite bank or circling low. She had scaled the sheer, wet rock face above the falls, positioning herself directly overhead, poised on a narrow, slick ledge. She was not armed with a rifle, but with a simple, heavy stone, the size of a man's head held in both hands. She wasn't aiming at him. She was aiming at the boulder he was hiding behind. The realization was terrifying. She wasn't interested in a fair fight or a quick kill. She was interested in absolute destruction. Jasper knew he had less than a second. If she dropped that stone, it would shatter his cover, pin him, or, worst of all, The impact noise would cover Caleb's crossing, which was her primary objective. He didn't fire at her. Instead, in a desperate, last-ditch maneuver, he rolled hard to the side, dropping his rifle and flinging himself onto the exposed, slick bank just as the woman released the stone. The impact was devastating. The rock struck the top of the large boulder with a tremendous crack, sending fragments of stone and moss showering everywhere. The concussion was deafening, amplified by the falls. The boulder didn't shatter, but the force of the impact was enough to dislodge several smaller supporting stones, sending them tumbling down the bank towards the water. In the confusion, Jasper saw Caleb, who had paused momentarily, surge forward. He covered the last few yards of the crossing in 3 massive strides, pulling himself onto the dense wooded bank that led away from the river. He was free. Jasper scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder from the fall. His rifle lay buried under a pile of moss and wet rock. He looked up, heart pounding, but the woman was gone again, having melted back into the fog and the trees after executing her strategic diversion. She had protected Caleb, not with a gun or a knife, but with cunning and gravity. Jasper swore violently, his voice raw. The bounty was gone, and his mission had failed catastrophically. He was unarmed, alone, and his partners were injured and trapped up the ridge. The only thing he had gained was a deep, paralyzing respect for the sheer intelligence and calculated ruthlessness of his enemy. He retrieved his rifle, finding the stock cracked but functional. He looked towards the path Caleb and the woman had taken, but the trail was lost in the thick, impenetrable brush. There was no choice now but retreat. He had to go back for Silas and Finn. He began the painful climb up the treacherous slope, his exhaustion absolute, the humiliation bitter. When he reached the ravine, the scene was worse than he had imagined. Finn was not pulling Silas out. Finn was standing at the edge, slumped and defeated. Silas was dead. He thrashed, Finn explained, his eyes hollow and filled with shock. I was securing the rope and he thrashed against his broken leg. He lost his grip and fell further, hit his head on a jagged rock. It was quick, Sarge. I swear it was quick. Jasper looked down into the dark chasm. Silas lay still, his body twisted awkwardly. The woman hadn't needed to kill Silas directly. She had just needed to place the perfect trap, knowing the human element, pain, panic, and an injured man's thrashing would do the work for her. 2 down. Only 2 bounty hunters remained, and the bounty itself was gone. We're done, Jasper said, the words heavy and final. We leave the bodies. We go back to the horses and we ride out. We tell them Caleb killed them. Finn nodded mutely, too broken to argue. But as they turned to leave, a flash of white caught Jasper's eye. A small strip of linen, tied tightly around a low-hanging branch directly above the ravine. It was a piece of Caleb's slave clothing, clearly not snagged accidentally, but placed. Pinned to the linen with a splinter of bone was another of the woman's unsettling markers. A simple, etched line. Jasper knew the message instantly. It was a silent, chilling tally. 3. 3 dead bounty hunters, and the message was clear. She was counting, and they were next. The retreat was agonizing. Jasper and Finn, now a pair of defeated, broken men, moved with a desperation that was rapidly giving way to paranoia. The loss of Silas, not by direct attack, but by a brilliantly executed trap, reinforced the woman's terrifying intelligence. She wasn't just a killer, she was a master strategist, leveraging the environment and their own humanity against them. They didn't dare use the ridge path again, fearing more hidden pitfalls. They forced their way through the thick forest, miles away from the creek, aiming for the spot where they had left their horses. Every rustle of leaves was the woman, every distant bird call was a signal. Finn, whose psyche had always been brittle, was shattering. She's still watching, Sarge. I can feel her eyes. She's toying with us. Why didn't she finish us off at the falls? Because she's not reckless, Jasper replied, though his own certainty was wavering. She got what she wanted. Caleb's freedom. Killing us now is an unnecessary risk. She only strikes when she has absolute advantage. We are no longer her target. We are just two fools running away. The thought was a crushing blow to Jasper's pride. They had become irrelevant, yet the psychological scar of the hunt remained. As they walked, the tension between them grew thick. The guilt over Silas's death, though caused by the trap, hung between them like a shroud. "You left him, Sarge," Finn mumbled suddenly, his eyes fixed on the forest floor. "You left Silas down there to go after the bounty." Jasper stopped dead. "I left him to secure the objective. If I had stayed, Caleb would have gotten away, and we would have been stuck there together when she came back." "But you left him," Finn repeated, a chilling, accusatory flatness in his tone. "And now he's dead. We came out here for money, but now it's just me and you, Sarge, and I got a question. When the next thing happens, are you going to leave me too?" The question was a direct challenge, not just to Jasper's leadership, but to his character. Jasper realized that the woman's strategy wasn't just about eliminating them physically. It was about destroying their trust, ensuring they would break each other before she even lifted a knife. "We stick together, Finn," Jasper stated firmly, meeting Finn's paranoid gaze. "We find the horses, we ride to the nearest settlement, and we tell a clean, simple lie. We never speak of the woman. We blame Caleb for all of it. Understand?" Finn nodded slowly, but the suspicion remained etched in his features. They walked for hours, the light beginning to fail. The atmosphere was turning from cold dread to deep, oppressive night terror. They knew the woman owned the darkness. They finally stumbled upon the horses, which were exactly where they had left them, tied loosely in the copse. A wave of relief washed over them, quickly followed by a fresh surge of dread. The horses were agitated, snorting and tossing their heads. And around the hooves of Jasper's own mount, the ground had been disturbed. Jasper knelt down, his muscles screaming from exhaustion. The disturbed earth wasn't from the horses stamping, it was deliberate. A small, shallow grave. And inside the grave, wrapped carefully in a layer of birch bark, was a single object: Jasper's wallet. He hadn't even realized it was missing. He had kept it tucked securely in an inner pocket of his coat. It contained his last remaining savings, a faded photograph of his dead wife, and his official identification papers. Details of his past he never spoke of. He opened the wallet with trembling hands. The money was all there. The photograph was untouched. But his identification papers had been replaced with a small, flat piece of wood. On the wood, carved with astonishing detail, was a miniature portrait of his wife's face. Jasper stared, utterly paralyzed. The terror was overwhelming, surpassing anything the three dead men or the fallen slave could have evoked. "She knows my wife," Jasper whispered, his voice cracking. "She knows who I was. She knows my life, Finn. She went through my pockets. She took the time to study the photograph, steal the papers, and carve this." Finn backed away, his eyes darting between the carving and Jasper's horrified face. "She was here, Sarge. She waited for us. And she didn't kill us. She gave you a message. The message was clear and devastatingly effective. I know who you are. I know what you value. And your past is now my leverage." The woman hadn't just hunted them in the wilderness. She had invaded the sanctuary of Jasper's memory and weaponized his personal life. It wasn't about the bounty anymore. It was an act of personal vengeance or intimidation, rooted in some unknown knowledge or connection. Jasper stuffed the carving into his coat, his hands shaking too violently to remount the horse. The guilt, the paranoia, and now the violation of his last personal boundary solidified the psychological horror. He was no longer Sergeant Crow, the ruthless bounty hunter. He was just a vulnerable man exposed in the deepest part of the forest, haunted by an enemy who knew him better than he knew himself. They mounted the horses, moving as quickly as the dark and the treacherous trail allowed. They rode east, away from the Shawnee territory, away from the falls, away from the woman. But Jasper knew that no matter how far they rode, the small wooden carving of his wife's face, resting against his heart, meant that the terrifying game was far from over. The woman hadn't just secured Caleb's freedom, she had claimed Jasper Crow's soul. The journey back to the nearest settlement, a dusty frontier town called Harmony Creek, took 2 grueling days. Jasper and Finn rode in almost complete silence, the only sound the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the anxious snorting of the animals. They avoided major trails, fearing the sight of another bounty hunter team, or worse, another marker from the woman. Finn was a shadow of his former self, constantly checking the woods, flinching at every shadow. Jasper, however, was encased in a cold, rigid determination. The wooden carving of his wife's face had crystallized his focus. He no longer cared about the bounty, he cared about survival and obliterating the evidence of what truly happened. As they rode into the outskirts of Harmony Creek, Jasper pulled his horse to a halt. The town was a miserable collection of rough-hewn buildings, a single tavern, and a general store, a temporary beacon of civilization. "We go over the story one last time, Finn," Jasper said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The 3 men, Silas and the other 2, were all killed by Caleb. Caleb was a beast, a monster, driven mad by his escape. He used cunning, strength, and stolen weapons. "The woman?" Finn asked, his voice cracking. "There was no woman," Jasper emphasized, staring hard at Finn. "The trail was confusing. We assumed the smaller prints were Caleb's when he was tired, or perhaps another runaway who fled at the sight of him. The woman does not exist. She is a fever dream, Finn. She is the guilt you feel for leaving Silas. She is not real." This psychological twist was Jasper's new weapon, rewriting reality to protect themselves. If they admitted the existence of the strategic, skilled, and untouchable killer, they would be admitting defeat, exposing their failure, and guaranteeing further pursuit from the woman if she perceived them as a threat. The lie would bind them in a conspiracy of silence. "If anyone asks about the deaths, they were brutal, yes, but consistent with the strength and rage of a giant cornered man," Jasper continued. "We barely escaped with our lives. The bounty is lost. The chase is over. We leave the territory." Finn swallowed hard and nodded. No woman, just Caleb, a monster. The story was believable enough for the frontier, a tale of a massive, enraged slave breaking free. It was a lie built on the public's worst fears, making it instantly consumable and, crucially, making them sound like victims rather than incompetent failures stalked by a superior mind. They rode into Harmony Creek. They sold their remaining equipment, purchased a generous supply of whiskey, and retired to the tavern, a dark, smoky place where the sound of their failure would be drowned out by drunken brawling and loud conversations. Jasper started his version of the event slowly, dropping hints to the tavern keeper, a man named Bartholomew with a face like a dried apple. 5 good men, Bart, gone. That giant Caleb. He had the strength of 10 men. He caught the first 3 unawares. We found them butchered. He made sure to drink heavily, playing the role of the traumatized survivor, adding layers of realistic detail, the mud, the cold, the sheer inhuman strength of the fugitive. Soon, a small crowd of rough-looking men, mostly trappers and small-time mercenaries, gathered around them, drinking in the tale. The terror in Jasper's eyes, though genuine, was now attributed to the slave, not the woman. One large burly man with a distinctive scar across his forehead, known only as the Grizzly, leaned in close. "But you let him go, Crow. That's a large bounty. Lost." "We had no choice, Grizzly," Jasper slurred, playing up the alcohol. "We barely made it out." My partner Silas, that man, was dragged off by the giant right in front of my eyes. A man that big, you don't fight him, you survive him. The story was working. The men around them murmured their condolences, impressed by the terror rather than the failure. But as Jasper looked down at his mug, he caught a reflection in the murky depths of the liquor. A faint shadow near the door of the tavern. He looked up quickly. The door was open slightly, letting in a draught of cold air and the smell of pine. Standing in the darkness, just outside the frame of the entrance, was a figure. A small, slender figure, draped in a dark cloak, the face obscured by shadow. Jasper's blood ran cold. It couldn't be. They had ridden for 2 days. She was miles away across the falls, securing Caleb's safety. He stared, trying to reconcile the figure with the mental image of his predator. It was too slight, too quick, too blurry to be certain. The figure stood for only a second, a silent sentinel in the dark. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it turned and was gone, leaving only the chilling, empty darkness. Jasper's hand shot instinctively to his inner pocket, grasping the smooth, unsettling contours of the carved wooden portrait. Was it her? Or was his mind finally breaking? He needed a distraction. He needed to be sure. "Finn, get more whiskey," Jasper roared, slamming his empty mug down. The sudden noise startled the crowd. As Finn shuffled nervously towards the bar, Jasper watched the door, his heart hammering. He excused himself, staggering slightly, and headed towards the outhouse behind the tavern, forcing himself to move normally, deliberately playing the drunk. He stepped out into the cold night air. The darkness was absolute. He fumbled in his coat for a small concealed pistol, his last resort. He didn't make it 2 steps towards the outhouse before he saw it. Tucked neatly beneath the tavern's single flickering oil lamp was a small, smooth river stone, the same kind she had used at the falls. It was impossible. She could not have followed them so quickly. It defied logic. Jasper picked up the stone, his breath hitching in his throat. It was cold, damp, and perfectly smooth. And etched into its surface, unmistakably, was a single, crude line. The mark of the tally. Jasper stumbled backward, clutching the stone. She was here. She had heard his lie. She had listened to him deny her existence. And she had left him a chilling reminder that the rules of the hunt were still hers, and that his psychological safety was an illusion. The terror was no longer confined to the frontier. It had followed him into the heart of civilization. The discovery of the marked stone in Harmony Creek shattered the fragile truce Jasper had made with reality. The lie he had concocted, that the woman was a myth, was instantly invalidated. She was real. She was closer than he thought, and she was deliberately inserting herself into his supposed sanctuary. Jasper shoved the stone into his pocket, his mind racing. He had to be calm. He was an experienced hunter. She was just one woman. But her calculated boldness, her ability to track and mark him so precisely, was a terrifying display of competence. He rejoined Finn in the tavern, forcing a laugh and slamming his empty bottle onto the table. "Damn cold out there, Finn. Need another drink." He watched Finn closely. Finn was still pale, but he was drinking heavily, seemingly trying to erase the memory of the woods. He hadn't noticed Jasper's distress, nor the figure at the door. Jasper needed to know. Was she only targeting him, or were they both in danger? "Finn." Jasper leaned in, his voice low and urgent, overriding the din of the tavern. "We leave at dawn. We go south, get out of this territory entirely. Get some rest, but sleep light. We trust no one." Finn just nodded vaguely, already halfway gone into the whiskey bottle. Jasper couldn't rest. He sat nursing his own drink, his eyes constantly scanning the tavern, looking for anomalies. A face that seemed too observant, a cloak that seemed too dark. He had a sudden paralyzing thought. Perhaps she hadn't followed them. Perhaps she had been waiting for them. Perhaps the Shawnee network, or Caleb's own connections, had alerted her to their pursuit, and she had taken the faster, more direct route to the town, laying her final snare. The mystery was agonizing. Why was she doing this? The protection of Caleb was achieved. Was this purely personal? Did their pursuit intersect with some past grievance she held? As the night wore on, the tavern cleared out. Bartholomew, the tavern keeper, began scrubbing the bar, occasionally giving Jasper and Finn a suspicious glance. Jasper decided he needed to break the silence and probe the environment. He approached Bartholomew, forcing a friendly, drunk slouch. "Tough night, eh, Bart?" "All nights are tough out here, Crow, especially for men who lose a high bounty and 2 partners. Lot of bad luck follows men like you." Jasper flinched internally at the word partners. Bart knew Silas was dead. Just bad luck and a monstrous runaway, Bart. The giant had the devil's own strength. Bartholomew wiped the bar slowly, his eyes meeting Jasper's. "That's what they say, yes. Big man. But, you know, sometimes a monster ain't the biggest thing you gotta worry about out here. Sometimes it's the quiet things, the things you don't see." Jasper's blood ran cold. Was Bart involved? Was he just suspicious? "What do you mean, Bart?" Bartholomew leaned in conspiratorially, lowering his voice. "A woman was asking about you earlier today, right after you left the general store." Jasper's heart hammered. "A woman? Who?" "Didn't catch her name, didn't see her face clearly. She was in a dark cloak covered up. But she was asking very specific questions. About the men riding north 2 days ago. About their horses. Said she was looking for a lost relative." Jasper managed a forced, dry chuckle. "Lost relatives? Lot of those out here, Bart. Couldn't have been us. We rode straight in." "She knew you, Crow. She knew your partner Silas was the one who chewed tobacco. She even knew Finn has a stutter when he's nervous." Bartholomew looked Jasper dead in the eye. "She knew things a lost relative wouldn't know. She was watching." Jasper thanked him, his throat tight, and returned to his table. The woman hadn't just beaten them in the woods. She had set up an elaborate social trap, using the casual information of the frontier to track them, anticipate them, and confirm their location. The figure at the door was not an illusion. The stone was not a coincidence. She was playing a game of deep psychological intrusion. He looked at Finn, who was now asleep, head slumped on the table, softly snoring. Jasper realized he couldn't afford to keep Finn alive. Finn was the weak link, the one who would crack, who would break the lie, and who would expose Jasper to a world that would label him a failure. Worse, Finn's presence was a distraction, an anchor that kept the woman's attention on them. Jasper made a terrible, final decision, a brutal extension of his self-preservation. He shook Finn awake, roughly. "Finn, come on, get up. We're leaving now. The air is bad here." Finn groaned and stumbled to his feet, swaying. Jasper led him outside into the icy cold of the pre-dawn. They reached the side alley where the horses were tethered. The shadows were deep, and the air was silent. "I can't see the horses, Sarge," Finn mumbled, squinting. "They're just around the corner," Jasper lied, pulling Finn deeper into the alley. As they reached the darkest point, Jasper drew his small pistol, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done terrible things before. He held the pistol against Finn's temple. Finn, drunk and confused, didn't react immediately. "Sarge." "What?" "The woman is real, Finn, and she knows everything. We can't take the risk that you'll talk. The lie has to be clean, and there can only be one witness left." Finn's eyes widened, the alcohol momentarily receding, replaced by pure, paralyzing terror. He tried to speak, but the stutter caught in his throat. Jasper pulled the trigger. The sound was muffled by the thick alley walls and the distance from the sleeping town. Finn crumpled without a sound. Jasper stood over the body, the smell of gunpowder and his own brutal desperation filling the air. 3 dead men. Now 4. All casualties of his own failure and the relentless psychological pressure applied by one woman. He took a moment, his breath hitching, and quickly planted the small pistol in Finn's hand. He then used a sharp stone to cut a deep gash on Finn's neck, making it look like a close-range knife fight. The story would be, Finn went mad, obsessed with the bounty, and attacked Jasper in a drunken rage. Jasper killed him in self-defense. The last witness to the woman was gone, and the lie was secured. Jasper turned to leave the alley, but as he moved, his boots scuffed against the wall. He glanced down. Tucked into the crack of the damp brick wall was another small, thin sliver of wood, and carved into it were 3 lines, the original tally, and beside it, a fresh, raw 4th line. She had been watching. She had known what he was going to do. Jasper stumbled away from the alley, not riding but fleeing on foot, leaving his horses and his bloody past behind. The terror was absolute. She was a psychological mirror, forcing him to commit the very acts of treachery and brutality that defined his profession. He wasn't just being hunted, he was being orchestrated. The final terrifying chapters are coming soon. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the conclusion to Jasper Crow's desperate flight. Jasper ran, not as a bounty hunter but as a terrified animal, driven by instinct and paralyzing fear. He left Harmony Creek on foot, plunging into the darkness of the woods before dawn, abandoning his horses, money, and the final remains of his identity. He had nothing left but the pistol and the weight of 4 dead men. The woman's surveillance, her absolute, chilling knowledge of his every move and intention, had stripped him of all psychological defense. She had forced him to murder Finn, not to secure her own safety, but to prove to Jasper that he was his own most dangerous enemy. He fled south, away from the Ohio River, aiming for the relative anonymity of the mountain passes. He survived on meager rations, snatching berries and small game, moving only under the cover of the densest trees. The fear of being seen was now secondary to the fear of finding one of her unsettling markers. The weather turned hostile, mirroring his internal state. A cold, relentless rain set in, turning the forest into a muddy, miserable swamp. The downpour washed away any tracks he made, which should have been a comfort, but it only amplified his sense of isolation. Days blurred into a single, exhausting flight. Jasper was weakened by hunger and lack of sleep. Every shadow was the woman. Every distant sound was Caleb returning for revenge. One evening, huddled beneath a massive, dripping hemlock tree, Jasper decided he had to stop running blindly. He had to understand her motive. It was the only way to anticipate her final move. He pulled out the only physical evidence of her existence, the small, perfectly carved wooden portrait of his dead wife. He stared at the smooth, unsettling contours. Why this? Why the deep, personal violation? He forced himself to remember. His wife, Clara, had died years ago from an illness back east. They had lived a simple life, but he had been a young man then, trying to make an honest living, sometimes working as a hired hand on wealthy estates near the coast. He closed his eyes, straining to remember any connection. Had he wronged someone then? Had he crossed paths with an injustice that somehow involved a Shawnee woman or a slave? He suddenly recalled a distant, unpleasant memory, a brief, brutal confrontation years ago. He had been working security for a wealthy landowner in Virginia. A woman, not indigenous, but a local free woman, had been accused of aiding a slave escape. Jasper had been ordered to track her down. He hadn't found her, but he had interrogated her family roughly, without compassion, driving them off the land. It was a common occurrence, a necessary evil of the time. He had forgotten the woman, forgotten the incident. Could this woman be connected to that old failure? Was she seeking revenge for a wrong he barely remembered committing? The idea was plausible, She wasn't just protecting Caleb, she was settling a score, operating with an ice-cold focus on psychological devastation. He realized the horror. He wasn't being hunted randomly. He was being held accountable for every cruel, pragmatic choice he had made in his life, and the woman was the merciless judge. Suddenly, a loud, snapping crack echoed through the soaked woods. Jasper scrambled up, pistol raised. It wasn't a deliberate signal. It sounded like a heavy branch giving way under stress. He moved towards the sound, creeping silently through the gloom. The branch had fallen near a small, abandoned hunting cabin, a dilapidated structure mostly collapsed, but offering a small, dry space beneath the remaining roof. As he approached, he saw a flash of movement. It was a man. Not Caleb, but a trapper, an elderly man in heavy furs, clearly injured. He was sitting with his back against the cabin wall, nursing a bloody, ragged gash on his arm. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay back," the old man rasped, lifting a rusty single-shot rifle with a shaky hand. "I'm warning you." "I'm not looking for trouble," Jasper said, keeping his distance. "I'm lost. Just need shelter from the rain." The trapper lowered the rifle slightly, examining Jasper's exhausted, terrified appearance. "You look like you've seen the devil, friend." "Worse," Jasper muttered, glancing around nervously. "A ghost." He sat down opposite the trapper, keeping his pistol hidden but ready. "You're bleeding bad," Jasper noted. "Trap got me. A bear trap," the trapper explained, wincing. "But not just any trap. It was set high on the wall, disguised perfectly, like it was waiting for a man, not an animal." Jasper felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a cleverly concealed, high-set trap. The woman's signature. How long ago? Hour or so. And before that, I saw something. The trapper leaned closer, his eyes darting into the trees. A woman, moving through the rain, covered in a dark cloak. She didn't see me. She was moving with purpose, quiet as a whisper. Jasper swallowed hard. He had led her here, or more accurately, she had anticipated his likely path and was securing her net. Did she say anything? Leave anything? No, but she was carrying something heavy. A bag, maybe. And she was looking down at the ground as she walked, like she was following a very specific, tiny trail, not tracks. Something else. Suddenly, the trapper gasped, his eyes fixed on the ground just beside Jasper's boot. Jasper looked down. A small patch of moss had been scraped away, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. And scraped into the earth unmistakably was a fresh line. The tally. The trapper screamed, a high, panicked sound. "She's here. She knows. She set the trap for you." Jasper stared at the mark. He had been moving so carefully, so focused on surviving the storm, that he hadn't noticed the ground beneath his feet. He was in the middle of her final snare. The trapper was collateral damage. The trapper's sudden fear and scream were the final, crucial noise in her orchestrated plan, the sound that told her exactly where her prey was located. Jasper raised his pistol towards the trapper. He had to silence him before the trapper's panic led to both of their deaths. But before he could pull the trigger, the trapper lunged, fueled by pure, desperate terror. The man grabbed Jasper's arm, not fighting, but clinging, trying to use Jasper as a shield. "Don't leave me! Don't leave me! She's coming!" They stumbled out of the meager shelter and into the torrential rain. Jasper struggled to throw the old man off, but the trapper's grip was locked on his wrist. The sound of the struggle and the trapper's desperate cries now cut through the rain and the wind, broadcasting their location to anyone listening. Jasper finally managed to break free, shoving the trapper violently back against the fallen log. The man crumpled, stunned, but alive. Jasper turned to run, but he froze. Standing between him and the dark forest, utterly silent, was the woman. She was soaked, her clothes plastered to her small frame, the rain washing the mud from her face. She held no knife, no rifle. She held only a small, heavy sack, which he dropped gently at her feet. Her face was revealed for the first time. High cheekbones, dark, cold eyes, and a mouth set in an expression of grim, resolute purpose. "Crow," she said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the drumming rain. She spoke English with a strong, unfamiliar cadence. "The tally is complete. Your escape ends here." The suspense was over. The physical confrontation had begun. The confrontation was silent, save for the incessant drumming of the rain. Jasper stood opposite the woman, his pistol leveled, his hand shaking less from fear and more from the sheer, primal shock of finally facing his tormentor. The trapper, forgotten, scrambled silently back into the shelter of the ruined cabin. "You killed them all," Jasper choked out, the accusation tasting like ash. "Silas, Finn, the others, for what? For a slave you barely know?" "No," the woman replied, her voice steady and clear, devoid of malice yet terrifying in its calm. "I killed them because they were hunting a man who was already free in his heart. And I killed them because their deaths protected the true quarry. You." She stepped forward, ignoring the pistol leveled at her chest. "My name is Lena. I am not Shawnee. I am the daughter of the woman you drove from her land outside Richmond 10 years ago." Jasper's blood ran cold. The forgotten injustice, the brief, cruel act of his past, had become the thread that bound his present horror. "Your father was Caleb's cousin. Your mother was only trying to warn him, to help him escape," Lena continued, her eyes fixed on his. "You harassed her. You burned their shack. You took the last thing they owned, a silver locket." Jasper vaguely remembered the locket, a trivial piece of property in a forgotten incident. "You destroyed them over nothing. When I found Caleb, my mother's kinsman, fleeing, and saw men like you pursuing him, I knew my time had come. Caleb was the bait. You were the only target. The entire hunt, the traps, the psychological terror, it was all an elaborate, 10-year-old act of personal vengeance." "The locket is in the sack," Lena said, gesturing with her chin towards the small, heavy bag she had dropped. "I traveled east after I secured Caleb across the river. I found your abandoned home. I found your wife's portrait. I learned everything about you. You shouldn't have come back," Jasper said, tightening his grip on the pistol. "You got your revenge. You've settled your score. Now, leave." "No, not settled. You still stand. You still breathe. The debt is not fully paid until the tally is final." Jasper knew he had to shoot. He couldn't hesitate. But Lena was still standing, exposed, yet radiating an absolute certainty that froze him. Suddenly Lena smiled, not the terrifying, calculating smile from the falls, but a sad, resolute twist of her lips. She raised her hands slowly, palms open, a gesture of disarmament, but also a final challenge. "Go ahead, Crow. Pull the trigger. Do it now, and you confirm that you are exactly the cruel, reckless beast I have spent a decade learning to despise." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't fighting for her life. She was fighting for his soul. She wanted him to prove her right, to commit one last cold-blooded murder to escape the reckoning. Jasper's finger trembled on the trigger guard. He saw the flash of the muzzle, the noise, the easy kill, the freedom. But he also saw the 4 dead men, his lost wife, the betrayal of Finn, and the small wooden carving burning against his chest. The woman had won the psychological war. He couldn't pull the trigger. Killing her would only solidify the monster she had helped create. "I won't," Jasper whispered, his voice broken. He let the pistol drop into the mud. Lena's expression did not change. She simply nodded, a confirmation of the truth she had forced him to face. She walked past him, silent and swift. She didn't look at the trapper huddled in the cabin. She didn't retrieve the sack. She simply moved towards the forest, the rain closing behind her like a curtain. Jasper sank to his knees in the mud, spent. It was over. After a few minutes, he slowly rose and staggered to the sack. He knelt and pulled the drawstring. Inside was a single, tarnished silver locket. It was old, scratched, and held a faded picture of a young indigenous woman, Lena's mother. The debt was indeed paid, and underneath the locket was a small, smooth river stone. Engraved on the stone were 4 lines, the complete tally, and below the lines a single new character, a circle. Jasper understood the final message. The circle meant closed or finished. The hunt was complete. He was free to live, but forever bound by the terror and the guilt she had placed upon him. He looked back at the ruined cabin. The trapper was gone, having fled silently during the confrontation. Jasper was alone. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood from the mud. He had survived the physical threat, but the psychological scars were permanent. He was a fugitive from himself, stripped of his profession, his savings, and his self-respect. The end of the hunt was not a climax of violence, but a terrifying denouement of psychological collapse. Lena, having forced Jasper to confront the cost of his own cruelty, vanished into the wilderness, leaving him alive but utterly broken. Jasper remained at the dilapidated cabin for 2 days, huddled, starving, and soaked. The silver locket and the final marked stone lay before him. He was haunted not by a ghost, but by the vivid, terrifying realization of his own moral bankruptcy. He finally emerged from the woods, thin, unshaven, and unrecognizable. He walked, not toward a settlement, but away from them, avoiding roads and people. He had no bounty to collect, no partners to bury, and no identity to claim. Sergeant Jasper Crow, bounty hunter, was dead. He eventually found work as a simple laborer on a remote farm far south of the Ohio Valley, where he adopted the name Jonah. He spent his days in silence, digging ditches and clearing fields, the monotonous labor a dull counterpoint to the relentless storm in his mind. He never spoke of the hunt. He never mentioned the bounty, the men who died, or the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. But the memories were physical burdens he carried daily. The smell of mud and blood from the first encounter, the chilling vision of Silas twisting in the ravine, the overwhelming shame of leaving Finn in the alley, the persistent cold pressure of the wooden carving of Clara's face, which he kept tied to a string around his neck, a permanent reminder of the privacy she violated. The true terror was not the fear of death, but the burden of freedom. Lena had left him alive, free to face the psychological consequences of his actions. She had transformed his life into a self-imposed prison, guarded by memory and guilt. One cold winter night, sitting by a weak fire in his isolated shack, Jonah decided he had to make some form of final restitution. He couldn't bring the dead men back, but he could acknowledge the truth. He found a smooth, dark piece of slate, used for roof repair. With a borrowed, sharp nail, he began to scratch 4 separate images onto the stone. 1. A rough sketch of Silas's rifle, a symbol of the life he abandoned. 2. A large, simple pine tree, for Finn, representing the woods where he died alone. 3. A broken manacle, for Caleb, whose freedom was bought with blood. 4. And finally, a small but sharp knife, for Lena, the instrument of his psychological execution. He wrapped the slate in rough cloth and buried it deep beneath the floor of his shack, a final secret grave for the life he had destroyed. Jonah lived out the rest of his days in silent solitude, a ghost in his own life. The story of the giant slave, Caleb, who killed 5 bounty men, became a legend in the Ohio Valley, a terrifying tale of a monster's rage. No one ever spoke of the woman, Lena, who had used human frailty and personal history as her deadliest weapons. Years passed. Jonah's hair turned gray, his back stooped. One afternoon, while working in the furthest field, he found a small, peculiar object stuck in the dry earth. It was a smooth, weathered river stone. He picked it up, his heart immediately seizing with a panic that had never truly left him. It was cold, damp, and familiar. He turned it over. There were no lines, no tallies, no terrifying messages. But etched into the center of the stone, weathered but visible, was a single, stylized mark. A bird in flight. He stared at the mark for a long time. Was it a final, cruel message? Or was it something else? He realized the mark was a release. The bird in flight symbolized departure, completion, perhaps even forgiveness, the final confirmation that she was truly gone, and that his psychological sentence was fully served. He understood then that Lena's goal was never his death. It was his transformation. She had stripped him down to his essential self and forced him to live with the consequences of his actions, proving that the most profound terror does not come from the supernatural, but from the brutal, unyielding reality of human accountability. Jonah dropped the stone back into the earth, covered it gently, and returned to his labor. He was finally, truly free. The terror had ended, but the weight of his guilt would follow him until his last solitary breath.